Dr. Alistair Finch prided himself on his dedication to the pursuit of knowledge, even when it led him to the fringes of conventional science. His latest endeavor was the culmination of years of research into the effects of prolonged sensory deprivation on the human psyche. He had secured funding for a state-of-the-art isolation chamber, a perfectly soundproofed and lightless environment designed to eliminate all external sensory input. For his first extended test, Alistair himself would be the subject. The initial hours within the chamber were surprisingly peaceful. The absolute silence was a novelty, a stark contrast to the constant hum of the outside world. Alistair felt a sense of profound relaxation, a shedding of the usual sensory overload that bombarded his consciousness. He focused on his breathing, his thoughts drifting in a calm, meditative state. But as the hours stretched into days, the tranquility began to fray. The silence, once soothing, now felt heavy, oppressive. Alistair started to hear things, faint whispers that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the chamber, indistinct murmurs just at the edge of his hearing. He tried to focus on them, to discern any discernible words, but they remained elusive, like half-forgotten memories teasing the edges of his awareness. Then came the visual distortions. Even in the complete absence of light, Alistair began to see faint patterns dancing before his closed eyelids, shifting colors, geometric shapes, fleeting images that seemed to have no logical origin. He knew these were likely hallucinations, the brain attempting to create stimuli in the absence of external input, but the sheer vividness of them was unsettling. As time continued to stretch on, marked only by his own internal clock, the hallucinations became more intense and more disturbing. The whispers grew louder, sometimes sounding like his own voice, other times like the voices of people he knew, whispering secrets he couldn't quite grasp. The visual patterns morphed into recognizable shapes, faces, distorted and grotesque, leering at him from the darkness. He even started to feel tactile sensations, the sensation of unseen hands brushing against his skin, the phantom weight of something pressing down on his chest. Paranoia began to take root in Alistair's mind. He had initially believed he was in complete control of the experiment, but now he couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. Was the chamber truly as isolated as he thought? Was someone monitoring him, manipulating the environment in subtle ways? He started to question the integrity of the equipment, the motives of his colleagues. One day, or what he perceived to be a day, Alistair started to hear a distinct sound, a slow, rhythmic dripping. It was faint at first, but it grew steadily louder, each drop echoing in the absolute silence like a hammer blow against his sanity. He tried to locate the source of the dripping, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a maddeningly persistent sound that burrowed into his skull. The visual hallucinations became increasingly terrifying. The distorted faces morphed into monstrous visages, their eyes burning with malevolent intent. The feeling of unseen hands touching him became more insistent, sometimes feeling like gentle caresses, other times like sharp, painful pinches. He started to talk to the darkness, his voice hoarse and cracking, begging for the sensations to stop, pleading for release from this sensory void that had become a torturous prison. Then came the moment when the boundaries of his own identity began to blur. He started to hear thoughts that weren't his own, alien voices echoing in his mind, sharing memories and emotions that felt both familiar and utterly foreign. He began to question who he was, whether he was still Alistair Finch, the rational scientist, or if he had become something else entirely, a composite of the sensory deprivation and the machinations of his own fracturing mind. One night, or what felt like night in the timeless void, Alistair experienced a vivid hallucination of the chamber door opening. A figure stood silhouetted against a blinding white light, its form tall and slender, its features obscured. It reached out a hand towards him, and a voice, both familiar and utterly unknown, whispered his name. Driven by a desperate hope for rescue, Alistair reached back, his fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. But as his touch connected, the white light intensified and the figure's form began to shift, its silhouette elongating, its limbs becoming spindly and unnatural. The voice changed too, morphing into a low, guttural growl that resonated deep within Alistair's bones. He recoiled in terror, realizing that this was no rescuer. This was something else, something that had been waiting for him in the sensory void, something that had been feeding on his isolation and his unraveling sanity. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy and unresponsive. He was trapped, utterly and completely trapped, in the darkness with this monstrous entity. Then, the dripping sound stopped. The whispers faded away. The visual hallucinations vanished. Alistair was left in absolute silence, absolute darkness, with only the lingering feeling of the creature's touch on his hand. He didn't know how much time had passed. It could have been days, weeks, months. He had lost all sense of time, all sense of self. He was simply there in the void. Suddenly, a faint light flickered on above him. The chamber door creaked open, and a group of his colleagues peered inside, their faces etched with concern. "Alistair, are you all right? We were worried when you didn't respond to the comms." Alistair tried to speak, but his voice was a mere croak. He looked at his hand, the one that had touched the figure in his hallucination. There was nothing there. His colleagues helped him out of the chamber, their voices sounding strangely distant and distorted. As he stepped back into the world of light and sound, Alistair couldn't shake the feeling that he had brought something back with him from the void. Something that still lingered in the silence, in the darkness, waiting for the next opportunity to reach out and touch him. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that the experiment was far from over. Stepping out of the isolation chamber was like being plunged into a cacophony of sensation. The gentle hum of the laboratory equipment felt deafening, the soft fluorescent lights burned his eyes, and the simple touch of his colleagues' hands on his arm sent shivers down his spine. The world, once familiar, now felt overwhelming, a chaotic barrage of stimuli that his senses struggled to process. He blinked, disoriented, his pupils struggling to adjust to the sudden influx of light. His colleagues, though relieved to see him conscious, exchanged worried glances. Alistair's skin was pale and clammy, his eyes darted nervously around the room, and his responses to their questions were slow and disjointed. He kept muttering about whispers and shadows, about a presence in the darkness, but his words seemed like the ramblings of someone teetering on the edge of sanity. They attributed it to the prolonged isolation, assuring him that these sensations would fade with time. But for Alistair, the feeling of being watched persisted. Even in the brightly lit laboratory, he would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the periphery of his vision, dark shapes that seemed to mimic the form of the faceless figure from the chamber. The silence, even the relative silence of the lab, was often punctuated by faint whispers that only he seemed to hear, murmurs that echoed the chilling pronouncements from his time in the void. Reintegrating into his normal life proved to be a torturous ordeal. Sleep offered no respite, as his dreams were now haunted by the faceless entity, its presence a constant, silent threat in the darkness of his subconscious. He became increasingly paranoid, distrustful of his colleagues, even of his own senses. He would often find himself staring into empty corners, convinced that he was being observed, that the thing he had encountered in the chamber had somehow followed him back.